The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and formal, bearing the letterhead of Harper and Associates law firm. I remember staring at it over my coffee, steam rising between my fingers and the paper, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. My grandfather had passed 3 weeks earlier, and while the grief still sat heavy in my chest, I wasn't prepared for what his final wishes would reveal about my family. I should probably start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about money or property or legal documents. This is about truth. The kind of truth that lives buried under years of family dynamics, under assumptions we make about who deserves what and why. The kind of truth that can split a room in half with just a few carefully chosen words. My name is Sarah, and I spent most of my adult life believing I was the disappointment of the family. The daughter who chose a career in social work over something more lucrative. The one who lived in a modest apartment while my brother Jake bought his 3rd car this year. The quiet one who never asked for much, never demanded attention, never fought back when family conversations turned toward who was succeeding and who wasn't. Growing up, the message was clear without anyone ever saying it directly. Jake was the golden child, the one who would carry on the family legacy, the son who made our father proud at every barbecue and holiday gathering. Me? I was the afterthought, the one who got polite smiles and gentle pats on the head while Jake got standing ovations for his latest business venture or real estate deal. My grandfather, though, was different. While Dad would barely glance up from his newspaper when I shared news about my work helping families in crisis, Grandpa would lean forward, asking questions about the people I helped, the challenges I faced, the small victories that kept me going. He understood that success wasn't always measured in dollar signs. When Grandpa got sick, I was the one who visited every weekend. I was the one who brought him his favorite coffee from the shop downtown, who listened to his stories about serving in Korea, who helped him organize his medications when his hands started shaking. Jake would stop by occasionally, usually with some urgent phone call that would pull him away after 20 minutes. Dad would visit when it was convenient, when it didn't interfere with his golf schedule or business meetings. But none of that prepared me for what happened at the law firm that Tuesday afternoon. The conference room smelled like leather and old wood, the kind of smell that whispers about important decisions and serious money. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes that probably cost more than I made in a month. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that looked like they belonged in a corporate boardroom. I arrived first, still wearing my work clothes, a simple navy dress and flats that had seen better days. The receptionist had offered me coffee, but my hands were already shaking enough. I sat near the middle of the table, clutching my purse and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building since I received the invitation to this reading. Dad walked in next, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. He carried himself like a man who owned every room he entered, shoulders back, chin raised, expensive suit perfectly tailored. He glanced at me briefly, nodded, then took his place at the head of the table like it was his natural position. Behind him came Jake, wearing a grin that suggested he already knew how this was going to play out. "Sarah," Dad said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "I'm glad you could make it." As if I had a choice. As if this wasn't about my grandfather, who I loved more than anyone in this room. "Of course I'm here," I replied quietly. Jake settled into the chair next to Dad, immediately pulling out his phone to check messages. "How long is this going to take?" he asked without looking up. "I've got a client meeting at 4. Dad waved a dismissive hand. "Shouldn't be long. These things are usually pretty straightforward." The way he said it made my stomach clench. Straightforward. Like Grandpa's life, his wishes, his carefully considered decisions about his legacy were just a formality to get through. Like the reading was an inconvenience rather than the final words of a man we'd all supposedly loved. Mr. Harper entered then. A distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a thick leather portfolio and moved with the careful precision of someone who had delivered life-changing news many times before. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, settling into his chair and opening the portfolio. "Thank you all for being here today. I know this is a difficult time for your family. Dad shifted impatiently. Let's get started, shall we? I assume the house goes to me as the eldest son. And then we can divide up the other assets accordingly. I felt my cheeks burn. The casual assumption in his voice, the way he spoke about Grandpa's possessions like they were already his, made me want to disappear into my chair. This was exactly what I'd expected. Dad taking charge, making decisions, treating me like a minor player in my own grandfather's story. Mr. Harper looked up from his papers, and something in his expression made me sit straighter. Actually, Mr. Morrison, that's not quite how this works. Your father left very specific instructions about how his estate should be handled. Of course, Dad said, leaning back confidently. I'm sure he wanted everything kept in the family. The house has been in our family for 3 generations. It makes sense for it to go to the next male heir. The casual sexism in that statement hit me like a slap. Next male heir. As if I didn't exist. As if my years of devotion to Grandpa, my weekly visits, my genuine care for his well-being counted for nothing because I happened to be born female. Jake looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving. The house is worth what, about $800,000? Plus, there's the cabin up north, the investment accounts. He was already calculating, already spending money that wasn't his yet. Gentlemen, Mr. Harper said, his voice carrying a warning note that made both Dad and Jake stop talking. I think you should let me read the will before making any assumptions. But Dad wasn't listening. He turned to me with that look I knew so well, the one that said I was about to be managed, handled, maneuvered into doing what he wanted. Sarah, honey, I know this might seem unfair, but you have to understand the practical side of this. You're single. You live in that little apartment. You don't have the resources to maintain a property like Grandpa's house. Jake, on the other hand, he's got the business, the connections, the ability to keep the property in good condition. The words stung because they carried just enough truth to hurt. I was single. I did live in a small apartment. I didn't make the kind of money that Jake did with his real estate investments. But the way Dad presented it made my life sound like failure, like my choices were evidence of inadequacy rather than different priorities. Dad, I started, but he held up a hand. I'm not finished. Look, we'll make sure you're taken care of. There are some smaller accounts, some personal items that meant something to you, but the major assets, the real value of the estate, that needs to go to someone who can handle the responsibility. Jake nodded along like this made perfect sense. Sarah, you know I'd help you out if you ever needed anything. It's not like we're cutting you out completely. The condescension in his voice made my hands clench in my lap. Help me out. Like I was a charity case. Like accepting crumbs from Grandpa's legacy should make me grateful. Mr. Harper cleared his throat pointedly. If I may continue with the actual reading of the will? Dad waved him on, clearly confident that the formalities would confirm what he'd already decided was true. The last will and testament of Walter Eugene Morrison, Mr. Harper began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. I, Walter Eugene Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my earthly possessions as follows. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of papers and the distant hum of traffic outside. To my son, Robert Morrison, I leave my collection of military memorabilia, my tools, and the sum of $50,000 from my savings account. Dad nodded, satisfied. $50,000 was substantial, plus he was clearly expecting the house and other major assets to be mentioned next. To my grandson, Jake Morrison, I leave my fishing equipment, my truck, and the sum of $25,000. Jake looked pleased but not surprised. Again, this seemed to be playing out exactly as they'd expected. To my granddaughter, Sarah Morrison, Mr. Harper continued, and I held my breath, preparing myself for the smaller inheritance Dad had already decided I deserved. But then Mr. Harper paused, looked directly at me, and smiled. To my granddaughter Sarah, who showed me more love and devotion in my final years than I had any right to expect, who visited me every week without fail, who listened to my stories and made my coffee just the way I liked it, who reminded me that kindness still exists in this world. My eyes filled with tears. Even from beyond the grave, Grandpa was seeing me, really seeing me, in a way my father never had. To Sarah, I leave my house at 1247 Maple Street, including all furnishings and belongings therein. I leave my cabin at Lake Morrison. I leave my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $1.2 million. I leave my savings accounts, totaling approximately $300,000. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Dad's face had gone completely white. Jake's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. "That can't be right," Dad whispered. Mr. Harper looked up from the will, his expression calm but firm. "I assure you, Mr. Morrison, these are your father's exact wishes, properly witnessed and notarized." "But the house," Jake stammered. "He always said the house would stay in the family." "It is staying in the family," I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. "I'm family." Dad turned to stare at me like I was a stranger, like he was seeing me for the first time and didn't recognize what he was looking at. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "Sarah, you can't possibly handle all this. You don't understand property management, investments, the responsibilities that come with this kind of inheritance." But Mr. Harper wasn't finished reading. "Furthermore," Mr. Harper continued, his voice cutting through Dad's protests like a blade through silk, "Mr. Morrison included a personal letter to be read aloud in the event that anyone questioned these arrangements." Dad's mouth snapped shut. Jake leaned forward, his earlier smugness replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. Mr. Harper reached into his portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, cream-colored and bearing Grandpa's distinctive handwriting in blue ink. The sight of those familiar loops and curves made my chest tighten with grief and something else, something that felt like vindication. "To my family," Mr. Harper read, "if you are hearing this letter, it means someone has questioned my final wishes regarding Sarah's inheritance. Let me be clear about why I have made these decisions." The lawyer paused, his eyes moving around the table before settling on Dad. "Robert, my son, I love you. But over the years, I have watched you measure success only in dollars and status. I have watched you dismiss your daughter's work helping families in crisis as somehow less valuable than your son's business ventures. I have watched you treat Sarah as an afterthought while elevating Jake simply because he carries our family name." Dad's face had progressed from white to a mottled red. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles stood out like mountain peaks. Mr. Harper continued reading. "Sarah has shown me what true character looks like. While others visited when it was convenient, she came every weekend. While others talked about their own achievements, she asked about my stories, my experiences, my thoughts. She brought me coffee and conversation. She brought me comfort in my final years when comfort was what I needed most." I wiped away a tear that had escaped down my cheek. Around the table, the silence was so thick it felt like a living thing. "Jake," the letter continued, "you are young and have time to learn what matters in life. I hope you will learn from your cousin's example that success is not just about accumulating wealth, but about how we treat others, especially when they cannot do anything for us in return." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his phone now completely forgotten on the table. The house, the cabin, the investments, they are going to Sarah because she alone among my family understood that relationships are built on presence, not presence. She understood that love is spelled T-I-M-E. She earned this inheritance not through birth order or gender, but through devotion. Mr. Harper folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The will concludes with instructions that these arrangements are final and legally binding, and that any attempts to contest them will result in the contesting party forfeiting their own inheritance entirely. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for water. "This is insane," he finally managed. "Sarah, you have to see how unreasonable this is. You can't possibly want all this responsibility. Think about the property taxes alone, the maintenance costs, the insurance." But his words felt different now. Where before they had carried the weight of paternal authority, now they sounded desperate, grasping. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that I felt dizzy with it. "Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "maybe the question isn't whether I can handle the responsibility. Maybe the question is why you're so sure I can't." Jake leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in. "Look, Sarah, let's be practical here. You could sell everything, take the cash, buy yourself a nice condo somewhere. You don't need all this property. Why don't we work out some kind of arrangement? I could buy the house from you at fair market value, keep it in the family the way Grandpa really would have wanted." The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, even after hearing Grandpa's letter read aloud, Jake was trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He was suggesting that what Grandpa really would have wanted was the exact opposite of what Grandpa had explicitly stated he wanted. "I don't think you understand," I said, feeling a strength I'd never experienced before rising in my chest. "This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a business deal. This was Grandpa's choice, and I'm going to honor it." Dad slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "You're being selfish, Sarah. You're thinking only about yourself instead of what's best for the family." The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. Dad, who had spent my entire life prioritizing Jake over me, who had dismissed my career and my choices at every opportunity, who had walked into this room assuming he could dictate how Grandpa's legacy would be distributed, was accusing me of selfishness. "Mr. Morrison," Mr. Harper interjected, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of dealing with family disputes, "I must remind you that these proceedings are being recorded, and your father's will is a legal document. Miss Morrison is under no obligation to justify her inheritance or to negotiate its distribution." But Dad wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disappointment or dismissal, but something closer to bewilderment, as if I had suddenly become a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You planned this," he said suddenly. "You manipulated him. You took advantage of an old man's loneliness." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Around the table I could feel the atmosphere shift again, this time toward something uglier and more dangerous. "That's enough," I said, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "I visited Grandpa because I loved him. I spent time with him because I enjoyed his company. I brought him coffee because it made him smile. If you can't understand that someone might do those things without an ulterior motive, that says more about you than it does about me." Dad stood as well, his face now fully flushed with anger. "Don't you dare lecture me about my own father. I knew him for 63 years. You think a few weekend visits in his final months made you special?" "No," I said, my voice rising to match his. "I think 63 years of taking him for granted, while I actually listened to him, made me special." The words hung between us like a thrown gauntlet. Jake looked back and forth between Dad and me as if he were watching a tennis match, clearly unsure which side was winning. Mr. Harper cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to process this information." But Dad wasn't finished. "You know what this is really about, don't you, Sarah? This is about you finally getting revenge for all those times you felt overlooked. This is about you trying to prove you're better than your brother." "This isn't about Jake," I said, and I meant it. "This isn't about proving anything. This is about Grandpa recognizing something that you never could." "Which is what, exactly?" "That I showed up." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they seemed to echo in the room anyway. When he was lonely, I showed up. When he was scared about his health, I showed up. When he wanted someone to listen to his stories about Korea for the 100th time, I showed up. Not because I wanted something from him, but because I loved him. Dad's anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. You think I didn't love my father? I think you loved the idea of inheriting from him more than you loved spending time with him. The silence that followed felt like the moment after lightning strikes, when the air itself seems to hold its breath waiting for the thunder. Jake finally spoke, his voice smaller than before. Sarah, what if we all just took some time to think about this? Maybe there's a way to work something out that honors Grandpa's wishes but also considers the practical aspects. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw something I'd missed before. Beneath the business suits and the calculated charm, beneath the confidence and the easy assumptions about his place in the world, Jake looked scared. Not angry like Dad, but genuinely frightened by the possibility that the future he'd been counting on had just evaporated. Jake, I said gently, Grandpa left you $25,000 in his truck. That's not nothing. That's a substantial gift. But the house, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. I had plans for that house. I was going to renovate it, maybe turn it into rental property. I've been working on the business plan for months. And there it was, the truth beneath all the family loyalty and practical concerns. Jake had been counting on inheriting Grandpa's house not as a home or a memory, but as a business opportunity. He had been calculating its value and planning its future while Grandpa was still alive, still sitting in that house drinking coffee and telling stories to anyone who would listen. Plans change, I said simply. Mr. Harper shuffled his papers and looked around the table. If there are no further questions about the will itself, we can proceed with the necessary paperwork for transferring the assets. Dad sat back down heavily, as if his legs had suddenly given out. This is a mistake, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. You'll see, Sarah. In 6 months, when you're dealing with property taxes and maintenance issues and investment decisions, you'll realize you're in over your head. Part of me wanted to argue with him, to defend my capabilities and my right to this inheritance. But another part of me, the part that had been strengthened by Grandpa's unexpected faith in me, simply smiled. Maybe I will, I said. But that's my choice to make now, isn't it? The finality of those words seemed to settle over the room like dust after an explosion. Dad stared at me as if I had grown a second head, his mouth working silently while he processed what had just happened. Jake looked between us, his phone now forgotten on the mahogany table, his carefully constructed future crumbling in real time. Mr. Harper began organizing the legal documents with practiced efficiency, but I could feel the weight of my family's stares. This wasn't how any of them had expected this day to unfold. In their minds, I was still the quiet daughter, the one who accepted whatever scraps were offered, who never made waves or demanded recognition. Sarah, Dad said finally, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Not the dismissive authority he usually wielded, but something smaller, more uncertain. You can't seriously be considering keeping all of this. I met his gaze steadily. Why not? Because, he sputtered, gesturing vaguely around the room as if the answer should be obvious. Because you're not equipped for this kind of responsibility. You work with families in crisis, for God's sake. You don't know anything about real estate management or investment portfolios. The condescension was still there, wrapped in concern, but I could hear the desperation underneath it now. Dad wasn't just worried about my ability to handle Grandpa's legacy. He was terrified that his assumptions about family hierarchy, about who mattered and who didn't, had been completely wrong. You're right, I said, surprising everyone, including myself. I don't know much about managing investment portfolios. I've never dealt with rental properties or significant real estate holdings. Dad's face brightened slightly, as if he thought I was coming to my senses. But you know what I do know? I continued. I know how to learn. I know how to ask for help when I need it. I know how to work hard and pay attention to details. And most importantly, I know the difference between earning something and expecting it. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, come on. You're making this sound like we didn't care about Grandpa. Didn't you? The question came out sharper than I intended. Jake, when was the last time you visited him without wanting something? When was the last time you called just to check how he was feeling? My brother's face flushed. I'm busy. I have a business to run, clients to manage. I can't just drop everything every weekend like you can. Like I can? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think my job is less demanding than yours? You think working with families who are losing their homes, dealing with domestic violence situations, helping kids navigate the foster care system is somehow easier than selling real estate? That's not what I meant, Jake said quickly, but we both knew it was exactly what he meant. Mr. Harper cleared his throat gently. Perhaps we should focus on the practical matters at hand. Miss Morrison, there are several documents that require your signature to complete the transfer of assets. I nodded, but Dad wasn't finished. Wait, he said, holding up a hand. Just wait a minute. Sarah, let's think about this logically. Even if you keep everything, you don't have to cut your family out completely. We could work together on this. I could help you manage the properties. Jake could handle the business side of things. We could turn this into a family enterprise. The offer hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I almost considered it. Almost. Because despite everything, despite years of being overlooked and dismissed, part of me still wanted their approval, still wanted to be included in their version of family. But then I remembered Grandpa's letter. I remembered his words about how I had shown him what true character looked like. I remembered all those Saturday afternoons when I sat beside his hospital bed while Dad was playing golf, and Jake was chasing his latest business deal. No, I said quietly. Dad blinked. No? No, Dad. I'm not turning this into a family enterprise. I'm not giving you and Jake a way to profit from something you didn't earn just because you're worried I can't handle it alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that suggested his blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. You ungrateful little, he started, then caught himself, glancing at Mr. Harper, who was watching the proceedings with professional detachment. Ungrateful? I repeated, standing up slowly. Ungrateful for what, exactly? For being ignored at every family gathering? For having my career dismissed as less important than Jake's? For being told that I should be grateful for whatever scraps might be left over after the men in the family took what they deserved? Jake tried to intervene. Sarah, that's not fair. We never said— You didn't have to say it. I cut him off. You showed it. Every single day for 32 years you showed it. Dad slammed his hand on the table again, making the legal documents jump. This is ridiculous. You're acting like we abused you or something. We gave you everything you needed growing up. You gave me food and shelter, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. You gave me the basics, but you gave Jake your pride. You gave him your encouragement. You gave him your belief that he could accomplish anything he set his mind to. When I got my master's degree in social work, you asked me when I was going to get a real job. When Jake bought his first rental property, you threw him a party. The truth of it hung in the room like a toxic cloud. Dad opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again when he realized he couldn't deny what I was saying. Mr. Harper shuffled, threw his papers and pulled out a thick folder. Miss Morrison, if you're ready to proceed, we'll need to review the property deeds and investment account transfers. I nodded, but kept my eyes on Dad. I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about proving a point or getting back at you for all the years I felt invisible. This is about honoring Grandpa's wishes and finally being seen for who I actually am instead of who you think I should be. Dad's shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked older than his years. Sarah, honey, I know I wasn't perfect, but I did the best I could. I worked hard to provide for this family, to build something we could all be proud of. You worked hard to build something Jake could be proud of, I corrected gently. I was just along for the ride. Jake leaned forward, his business instincts still trying to find an angle. Look, what if we compromise? You keep the house, I'll take the cabin and maybe some of the investment portfolio. Dad gets the savings accounts. We all win. I stared at him in amazement. Even now, even after hearing Grandpa's letter read aloud, Jake was still trying to negotiate his way into a piece of my inheritance. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained he couldn't even recognize it anymore. Jake, I said slowly, this isn't a business deal. This isn't something we're dividing up based on what you think is fair. This is what Grandpa wanted, period. But it doesn't make sense, Jake insisted. Why would he leave everything to you? I'm the one with business experience. I'm the one who could have helped him with his investments. Maybe that's exactly why he didn't leave it to you, I said. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Jake's face went white, then red, then white again. Mr. Harper spread several documents across the table in front of me. Miss Morrison, I'll need your signature on these transfer documents. The first is for the house on Maple Street, including all furnishings and personal property. The second is for the cabin at Lake Morrison. This one transfers the investment portfolio, and this final document handles the savings accounts. I picked up the pen he offered me, a heavy silver instrument that felt substantial in my hand. As I signed the first document, I could hear Dad's labored breathing from across the table. The investment portfolio, Mr. Harper continued, is quite diversified and has been performing well. Your grandfather was a careful and conservative investor. I have the contact information for his financial advisor, whom I'd recommend you continue working with, at least initially. I signed the second document, then the third. With each signature, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders, but also something else: freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I had the resources to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. The cabin, Mr. Harper said, has been in your family for 3 generations. Your grandfather was quite specific about wanting it to remain a place of peace and reflection rather than being developed or sold. I signed the final document and set the pen down. It will be. Dad had been silent through the entire signing process, but now he cleared his throat. Sarah, I hope you know what you're doing. This kind of wealth, this kind of responsibility, it changes people. It changes relationships. I looked at him across the mahogany table. This man who had shaped so much of my life through his expectations and disappointments, his assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. Dad, I said softly, our relationship changed a long time ago. Today just makes it official. Mr. Harper gathered the signed documents and placed them in a manila folder. Miss Morrison, these will be filed with the appropriate county offices within the next week. You should receive copies of all final documentation within 10 business days. I'll also arrange for you to meet with your grandfather's financial advisor next week, if that works with your schedule. I nodded, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of an hour, I had gone from being the overlooked daughter to being a woman of significant means. The transformation felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. Jake was staring at the table, his phone still lying there forgotten. $1.5 million, he said quietly. Plus the properties, plus everything else. Jake, I said, but he held up a hand. No, it's fine, it's just... He trailed off, shaking his head. I had plans, you know. I had it all figured out. The house was going to be my ticket to the next level, the thing that would let me expand the business, maybe start that development project I've been dreaming about. Those plans were based on something that was never yours, I pointed out. I know that now, he said, and for the first time since we were children, Jake sounded genuinely sad rather than angry or calculating. I thought family meant something different than it apparently does. Dad finally stood up, his movements stiff and uncertain. Well, I guess that's that then. I guess it is, I agreed. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with something. Pride, maybe, or the simple inability to understand how the world had shifted so completely in the space of an afternoon. Your grandfather, he said finally. He always was stubborn. Once he made up his mind about something, that was it. He was, I agreed. But he was also fair. Dad's laugh was bitter. Fair, right. Mr. Harper stood as well, signaling that our business was concluded. Miss Morrison, please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions as you begin managing these assets. Your grandfather spoke of you often, and always with great affection and respect. The words brought tears to my eyes again. Thank you. That means more than you know. As we filed out of the conference room, I felt the weight of my family's stares, their resentment and confusion and disbelief. But I also felt something else. Something I'd been missing for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt like I mattered. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't need anyone else's permission to feel that way. The afternoon sun was bright as we stepped out of the law office, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting it warm my face. Dad and Jake walked toward their cars without saying goodbye, their heads bent together in urgent conversation that I didn't strain to hear. I knew this was just the beginning. There would be phone calls and family meetings and attempts to make me feel guilty for accepting what Grandpa had freely given. There would be practical challenges and learning curves and mistakes along the way. But as I walked toward my car, keys jingling in my hand, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because of the money or the properties or the investments, but because someone had finally seen me clearly enough to trust me with their legacy. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the rest of it combined. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and reality setting in. I spent my first night in Grandpa's house sitting in his old recliner, surrounded by the familiar smell of pipe tobacco and Old Spice that still lingered in the fabric. The silence felt different than the silence in my apartment. Heavier, more significant, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do with this unexpected gift. The first challenge came sooner than I expected. 3 days after the will reading, my phone rang at 7 a.m. Dad's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But some old habit, some deeply ingrained sense of family obligation, made me answer. Sarah. Dad's voice was tight, controlled in that way that meant he was barely containing his anger. We need to talk. Good morning to you too, Dad. Don't be smart with me. I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I've talked to a lawyer of my own. There might be grounds to contest the will. My stomach dropped. On what grounds? Undue influence. Manipulation of an elderly person. You spent all that time with him in his final months. You could have pressured him, convinced him to change his will when he wasn't thinking clearly. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Dad, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything? You think there won't be consequences? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was up against. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about Dad's entire understanding of how the world was supposed to work, how families were supposed to function, how power was supposed to flow from one generation to the next. Dad, Mr. Harper made it very clear that the will is ironclad. Grandpa was evaluated by doctors just months before he died. He was completely competent when he made these decisions. Doctors can be bought, Dad said, and the cynicism in his voice made me sad in a way I hadn't expected. Listen to yourself, I said quietly. You're so convinced that I don't deserve this inheritance that you're willing to believe Grandpa was either incompetent or that I'm some kind of master manipulator. Which one is it, Dad? Either your father was a foolish old man who could be easily deceived, or your daughter is a calculating schemer who spent years playing a long con. Neither option reflects very well on your judgment, does it? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. You've changed, he said finally. No, Dad, I haven't changed. You're just finally seeing me. After we hung up, I sat in Grandpa's kitchen drinking coffee from his favorite mug, the one with the faded navy anchor that he'd had since his service days. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, and I tried to imagine him sitting in this same spot, making the decision to trust me with everything he'd built. The financial advisor meeting that Mr. Harper had arranged was scheduled for that afternoon. I'd spent the morning reading through investment statements and account summaries, trying to make sense of numbers that seemed almost fictional in their magnitude. Grandpa had been more successful than any of us had realized, more careful with his money, more strategic in his planning. Margaret Chen turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of the best supervisors I'd worked with in social services. She arrived at the house precisely on time, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the sort of confident smile that suggested she'd guided many people through similar transitions. "Your grandfather spoke about you often," she said, as we settled in the living room. "He was very proud of your work, your dedication to helping others." "He never mentioned working with a financial advisor," I admitted. "I had no idea he'd accumulated this much wealth." Margaret smiled. "Walter was a private man, but he was also incredibly disciplined. He lived below his means for decades, invested consistently, and never made emotional decisions about money. The portfolio we built together was designed to provide long-term stability and growth." She opened her briefcase and spread several documents across the coffee table. Charts and graphs and statements that told the story of careful planning and patient accumulation of wealth. "The investment strategy he chose is quite conservative," she continued. "Government bonds, blue-chip stocks, some real estate investment trusts. Nothing flashy or risky, but steady growth over time. The annual dividends alone should provide you with a comfortable income, even if you never touch the principal." I stared at the numbers, still struggling to process their reality. "What kind of income are we talking about?" "Based on current market conditions, approximately $80,000 to $90,000 per year in dividend income, plus whatever rental income you might generate from the properties if you choose to lease them." $80,000 to $90,000. More than twice what I made at my job in social services. Enough to live comfortably without ever worrying about rent or groceries, or whether I could afford to fix my car when it broke down. "Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes for the portfolio," Margaret said. "He wanted it managed conservatively, with a focus on preservation rather than aggressive growth. He also established some charitable giving guidelines that he hoped you might consider continuing." Charitable giving. She pulled out another folder. "Walter donated anonymously to several organizations over the years. The Veterans Hospital, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, a local food bank. He never wanted recognition, just wanted to help quietly where he could." Of course he did. Even in death, Grandpa was teaching me something about what wealth could be used for, about the responsibility that came with having more than you needed. "I don't have to make any decisions today, do I?" I asked. "Not at all. Take your time. Learn about the investments, understand what you've inherited. When you're ready, we can discuss any changes you might want to make. But honestly, what your grandfather built is solid. You could leave everything exactly as it is and be perfectly fine." After Margaret left, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was a trust, a responsibility, a testament to Grandpa's faith in my judgment. Every room held memories, but also potential. Decisions to be made, choices about what to keep and what to change, how to honor the past while building something for the future. The phone rang again as I was examining the books in Grandpa's study. Jake this time. That phone call from Jake never came. In fact, I haven't heard from either of them in 6 months now, and I'm learning that silence can be its own form of peace. I kept my job in social services, not because I needed the money anymore, but because the work still mattered to me. The families I help don't care about my inheritance. They care about someone showing up when they need help most, and that's something no amount of money can teach you. Grandpa's house has become more than just a place to live. It's become a sanctuary, a place where I can finally breathe without worrying about approval or judgment. And every morning when I drink coffee from his old Navy mug, I remember what he taught me about the difference between being seen and being valued. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who see you clearly enough to trust you with their legacy, even when your own family can't.